this is something very interesting and very, very India specific, right? So fundamentally, compared to every other country in the world, India spends a lot more money on transportation, right? The US is around 5.6%. Everybody is basically below 10%. India spends about 13.1% of their wallet share on transportation. The fundamental reason why this is that in India, specifically, the public transport system really does not work, right? The public transport system is not accessible to people. It's not within 1 kilometer from where you live. And if the public transport system is actually not within 1 kilometer from where you live, it's not relevant, right? That's where the fundamental problem more or less starts from. And hence people end up spending a lot of money. So what do you do when you don't have your vehicle? And this is something each of you would have experienced. Some of India goes and buys a car, gets a driver and starts using that to go from point A to point B, right? Most of India actually goes and buys a scooter, right? And this is something I did myself. And one of the reasons we actually started this company is that from between the founders, from most people we met, it's basically that you for a year or two use public transport, use private transport, at some point it fails you, right? And then you decide it's much easier to just buy my own car or buy my own scooter and then go from there, right? And when you think about, and that just solves your problem at least for the beginning, right? And when you want to take it from there and think about why is vehicle ownership not really working, right? Fundamentally, everybody, right, is using their vehicle maybe for 5% of the whole month. You don't really use your vehicles. 95% of the time, it's in the parking in your home or parking somewhere in your office, right? And why do you need to own an asset like this? This asset is basically on demand. Everywhere, in every industry, you're seeing that the shared economy basically leads to people essentially using their asset for essentially any kind of usage which is around on demand, right? And if the whole thing is around on demand, then why do you need to own your asset? That's what it boils down to. So if you think about the fact that people don't need to own vehicles anymore, right? Then how do you think of transportation? Transportation is meant to be on demand. And when people think about transportation, there are three things that anybody is looking for, right? Whether it's an Ola, Uber, Auto, anybody who's trying to solve transportation optimizes for three things, right? The first is, how do I go from point A to point B in the fastest way possible? How do I go from point A to point B in the most affordable way possible? And how do I go in the most convenient and the most comfortable way possible, right? This is what any transportation option essentially looks to solve, right? And today, if you look at it, all of these solutions are basically solving for it by using large form factors. Whether it's a bus, whether it's a cab or it's an auto, you're really paying for these 3 empty seats or these 2 empty seats. You're paying for the driver, right? And when you do that, you're essentially paying more. You're also contributing to traffic, you're contributing to congestion, right? If you then sort of break it down and look at what can actually solve this for India, right? The way we are looking at it is that if you just take a fleet of scooters, you tell people you don't need to own vehicles anymore, right? You don't, so today it's 2-wheelers, it is 4-wheelers, it's 3-wheelers, but 2-wheelers is the largest way in which people essentially move around, right? And if you look at 2-wheelers and say that people don't need to own vehicles anymore, and you just have these scooters everywhere all across the city, which means that as a customer, what you can do is instead of buying your own vehicle, you just walk up to the scooter, you pick it up, you drop it off at the nearest metro, at the nearest bus station. If it's a 5-kilometer trip, you just drop it off at your final destination, and your trip is done, right? So think about most of India. So it may not be so relevant for this audience, but for most of India, it's basically about if you want a 2-wheeler, the 2-wheeler is the fastest way to actually go from point A to point B. So what we have done is fundamentally taken that same asset, the scooter, right? The scooter which everybody is familiar with, and use that to essentially enable an on-demand transport platform, right? The way it works is basically you essentially open your app, you find the nearest scooter, it could be a line of sight solution. The idea is it will be ubiquitous, it will be everywhere. When you do that, you walk up to the scooter, there's a locking, unlocking mechanism to pick it up, and you can pick it up and drop it at point B, right? So this is, over the last 6 months, we've grown very, very rapidly. We've now reached almost 1 million plus completed rides. We've grown around 15 times over the last 6 months, right? Around the top 20% of our customers are actually using us 20 times a month, which means that these people are deciding not to own vehicles anymore, right? So how we think about this at scale, right? At scale, the way to look is, if there are 20 million vehicles being bought every year in India, 20 million 2-wheelers, right? That's a very, very large number, right? After buses, the number of private scooter trips are the largest number of ways in which actually people travel today. What will happen is essentially at some point in time, ownership becomes history. People don't need to own a vehicle anymore because it just becomes about, if it is right outside your doorstep, why do you need to own that vehicle? Why do you need to maintain it? Why do you need to figure out how to park it? You just use it to go from point A to point B. It saves you a lot of time in terms of congestion overall from an infrastructure perspective, because there are fewer vehicles on the road, there are fewer cabs, there are fewer autos on the road, right? there are fewer own vehicles which are actually parked. So parking leads to actually 40% of congestion. So the number of vehicles on the roads have reduced, and hence that in itself reduces congestion. And people are actually paying much, much lesser than what they would normally pay, right? So the way, and in the future, if you think about it, 3 years, 5 years down the line, the world is going to be electric, right? And when that happens, this is basically a way to essentially make electric first with a rental or a sharing kind of concept, where people can essentially use electric vehicles to go from point A to point B, and nobody owns their own scooter anymore, and that becomes a way in which the world essentially travels. So fundamentally, our vision is, how do you make the world change? How do you make transportation a non-asset based system? Because even today, right, after cabs, after autos, after 10 other forms of transport, most people are still buying their own vehicles, right? How do you get that to change? And that's the fundamental change we're looking to bring to this business. That's it from me. Thank you so much.